everyone, welcome back to my channel where we break down cybersecurity concepts in simple terms. This video is all about clause 6 and in particular subclause 6.1. This is the part 2 of clause 6 where we will be discussing about subclause 6.1 and subclause 6.1.1, 6.1.2 and 6.1.3. We'll also discuss the mandatory documents that are required and the auditor's expectations to be compliant with the clause 6.1. So let's dive into it. 6.1 is actions to address risks and opportunities. 6.1.1 6.1 is subdivided into 6.1.1, 6.1.2 and 6.1.3. 6.1 general mostly talks about how you identify the risks and opportunities in your organization. Okay. 6.1.2 talks about complete risk assessment. Whatever risks that you identify, how will you assess those risks? And 6.1.3 talks about how you're going to treat those risks. 6.1 when planning the information security management system, the organization shall consider the issues referred in 4.1 and the requirement referred in 4.2. So if you have not watched my video for clause 4, I would request you pause this video here and go back to my clause 4 video. But to give you a very brief introduction of clause 4, of what clause 4.1 and 4.2 says. Clause 4.1 talks about understanding the organization, whereas clause 4.2 talks about understanding the needs and expectations of your interested parties. Now, understanding the organization and its context is you just want to understand what are the external and internal issues related to your organization. For example, the internal issues could be that do you have a good IT infrastructure? Is the infrastructure well designed? And what could be the external issue? External issues could be the cyber threats that your organization can face. How well are you equipped to face those cyber threats? You need to have a better understanding of these internal and external issues which are related to your organization. Clause 4.2 talks about understanding the needs and expectations of your interested parties. Now, who are the interested parties? The interested parties are your customers, or it could be your investors, for example, right? What are the expectations of your customer? They just want that whatever payments that they do online are secure and their data is also secured. And what are the expectations of your investors? The investors expect that you maintain a good reputation for your company. This was a quick brief of what 4.1 and 4.2 talks about. So based on this, clause 6.1.1 expects you to determine the risks and opportunities that needs to be addressed in your organization. So based on your customer, based on your organization, based on your interested parties, you have to identify what are the risks and opportunities in your organization that you need to address. So how will you address that? For that, it says you have a good plan. How do you have a plan? You ensure that your information security management system can achieve its intended outcome. To what is the outcome of having an ISMS? The whole idea to have a good ISMS or to plan is to plan your risks, or the whole idea of having a good ISMS is to prevent or reduce the effects of the risks that are actually existing in your environment, and also have a continual improvement. Like always go back and check, okay, are these risks addressed? And if they're not addressed, what is your plan for it to address those risks in future? And how do you continuously improve your ISMS? So you have a good planning towards your ISMS. The organization shall plan actions to address these risks and opportunities. So it says that once you identify the risks, have a planning to take some actions to reduce these risks. And how it can do that? It can do it by how to integrate and implement the action. So how can you take the actions and how can you plan to address these risks? It says that you implement the actions into information security management processes. So it says that you integrate and implement certain actions. These actions, whatever you identify, you try to integrate them and implement them in your ISMS. And then once you implement these actions, you also evaluate. What do you mean by evaluate? Like come back and see, okay, we have implemented these actions or controls for that matter. Now, after implementing these controls, are they working fine? For example, okay, now you identify that there is a risk in your organization. You are having insecure payment transaction. So once this risks is identified, what do? You will start making sure that you have good PCI DSS controls in place, right? So this is the action plan. This was the risk that you identified. Now, how do you evaluate? You have to make sure that your vulnerability report and your pen test report is not showing any vulnerabilities against these items. So in that way, you evaluate the effectiveness of the controls that you have implemented. So this is 6.1.1, where it only talks about having a proper plan. See, when you have a good plan for anything in life, see, if you have a good plan, then most of the time you will success, right? There's always a saying, if you fail to plan, you are planning to fail. Have a good plan. Ensure you have a good plan to all the risks in your organization. Now, 6.1.2, information security risk assessment talks about assessing the risk. Let's read through clause 6.1.2 and understand what it actually says. The organization shall define and apply an information security management assessment process. The organization shall define and apply the information security risk assessment process that establishes. So it says that you have a risk assessment process in place. What is a risk assessment process? If you remember, in my previous part 1 video of clause 6, I had talked about the risk register. It explains how exactly you need to perform an assessment to your risks. Just to give you a quick brief, we have a customer database and you have a weak password in this database. So you know that if this vulnerability is exploited, you will have a high impact, and the likelihood of this vulnerability getting exploited is 4, right? So the score becomes 20. Based on the likelihood and impact of the risks that you have identified, you have to take actions. In simple terms, the whole process of assessment is nothing but identifying how much impact this risk can cause to your organization based on the likelihood. How frequent do you think this risk can be exploited? Based on this, if you come to a score, or if you can come to a judgment, then the entire process is called risk assessment. This is what 6.1.2 talks about. It says the organization shall define and apply an information security risk assessment process that establishes and maintains information security risk criteria. The organization shall define and apply an information security risk assessment processes that establishes and maintains information security risk criteria. So what it says is you have to have a risk assessment, and then based on this assessment, you have a risk criteria. Remember, in my risk register, I said that if my risk score is more than 20, then it becomes critical. If it is somewhere less than 5, then it is low. So like this, you have a criteria. If you have not watched that part 1 video, I request you to go back and watch that video and come back to this video. That case, you will understand this clause much better. So this says the risk acceptance criteria. So there is also a risk acceptance, right? So if you say, okay, this risk is acceptable for me, I don't want to invest so much of money in implementing this risk because implementing the control is costing me more, then I'm going to accept this risk. So your organization should define the risk acceptance criteria, the criteria for performing information security risk assessment, and also a criteria when you're going to perform a risk assessment. If you think that risk is really critical and it is having a great impact, then perform a risk assessment. To ensure that repeated information security risk assessment produce consistent, valid, and comparable results. What is this sentence? It's a very beautiful sentence. It says that ensure that repeated information security risk assessment. For example, I'm a manager, okay? So I will do a risk assessment. And then I have my team leader. He also will do the risk assessment. Fine. I have my client. He also will do a risk assessment. So all these 3 people will do a risk assessment, say on payment transaction only for my online delivery app. So when all these people do a risk assessment, all should come to a common conclusion. If you do not come to a common conclusion, which means your risk assessment is not right. You should define proper risk assessment criteria for your organization. Say, for example, for me, payment transaction is not the impact of payment transaction is not very critical. Say I say it is 3, but for my team lead, he's saying no, it is a very critical transaction. You have to make sure that you give a high score to it. So if there is such variations in your assessment, then you need to rethink about it. That is what this sentence says. Ensure that the repeated information, whoever is doing, when you are multiple times also, if you do the repeated information security risk assessment, produce consistent, valid, and comparable results. You should get consistent results from it, and it should be valid and it should be comparable. Identifies that information security risks, apply the information security risk assessment processes to identify risks associated with the loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability for information within the scope of the information security management system. Yes, this is a very long sentence, but it makes a lot of meaning. Whole cybersecurity, foundation of cybersecurity is CIA: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So, how do you identify a risk or how do you assess a risk? Based on these 3 foundational pillars, you should perform a risk assessment. See, if there is any risk that is identified in your organization, ask yourself, is it affecting the confidentiality of the data? Is it affecting the integrity of the data, or is it affecting the availability of the data? Based on this, give a score to your risk. So that is what this sentence is. Let's read it together. Apply the information security risk assessment process to identify the risk associated with the loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability for the information within the scope of the information security management system. Whenever then ISMS is created, right, you should define a scope. What do you mean by scope? Say the scope could be even in the audit or whenever you're preparing ISMS, say you say, okay, in our scope, we are only taking databases, we are taking the network system, and we are taking, say, the customer data. So within, if this is the scope of your ISMS, because see, the organization is very vast, to do it at one go, it's going to be a tedious task. So you break in you break it down and limit the scope and then start preparing an ISMS. That is what it happens, and then you can collate it together as well. So within the scope of your ISMS security of your ISMS, ensure that what are the risks that are causing a loss to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of your information. Based on that, you have to perform the risk assessment. Okay, and then what it says, identify risks owners. This is very, very important. You cannot live any risks without having or identifying a risk owner. It's just like, if you don't have any home, like you just can't be homeless, right? Any risk, once you associate a risk owner to the risk, then it becomes his responsibility to ensure that the risk is being treated. So it is very important for you to have a risk owner. Most of the time, the risks owner are nothing but the business owners, or if it is a database risk, then the database manager. These risk owners should have those responsibility to take actions, right? See, an analyst, L1 engineer can never be a risk owner because he does not have the authority to implement or to give any guidance to implement the controls or talk to the management about implementing any controls or have the authority to implement the controls or provide the approval to implement the controls, right? A L1 engineer would not have it. So most of the time, the risk owners are the business owners or the managers, the product managers. D. Analyze the information security risks, assess the potential consequences that would result if the risk is identified, then if the risk has been identified, then just assess the potential consequences. What would happen if this risk is being identified? What could be the consequences that it can cause to the company? Assess that as well. Occur. Assess the realistic likelihood of the occurrence of the risk identified and determine the level of risk. When I say level of risk, I just mean give the priority to the risk or how much impact this risk can cause. Evaluate the information security risk. Then it says evaluate the risk. Compare the result of the risk analysis with the risk criteria established. And so it says compare the results of the risk analysis, right? You just compare, okay, what would be the risk analysis with the risk criteria. So this is the risk criteria and this is the risk analysis that we have done. We have done the risk analysis and we have got this data and this is the criteria of the risk. So compare the results of this risk analysis and the risk criteria that you have established. Prioritize the analyzed risk for risk treatment. So if you analyze any risks that are very critical or you identify any risk, then go for a risk treatment, right? Whether you want to accept the risk, whether you want to treat the risk, whether you want to transfer, whether you want to mitigate. If you haven't watched my part 1 video, just go back and watch that, because only when you watch that you will understand what these sentences mean. So it says prioritize and analyze risks for risk treatment. The organization shall retain documented information about the information security risk assessment process. Remember, I showed you the risk register. In that risk register, you also mention how exactly you are performing the risk assessment. What is the likelihood ratings that you have given? What is the impact rating that you are given? What is the risk score that you are giving? And how you are identifying that this is high, this is low. The auditor will ask you to show your risk assessment criteria, how you're analyzing the risk, how are you giving the rating to your risk, where are you exactly documenting, who is the risk owner, what is the current status of the risk. So all these things is what your auditor will check. So it's important for you to maintain the risk register. 6.1.3 talks about risk treatment. Now, how do you treat the risk? Let's read through this clause line by line again. The organization shall define and apply an information security risk treatment process. So it says you should have a risk treatment process. Remember, we talked about MATA, mitigate, accept, transfer, and avoid. It says that you should have a risk treatment process to select appropriate information security risk treatment options. So it says you should select an appropriate risk treatment, not that, if you need to avoid it, you're still transferring it. Don't do that. So it says have appropriate information risk treatment options taking account of the risk assessment results. So based on the risk assessment results, make sure you're actually doing a proper risk treatment. Determine all controls that are necessary to implement the information security treatment. So it is saying just check whatever control is required, implement this. For example, for a payment transaction, what are the controls that are required? You should have good encryption in transit, right, in place. So you should have a TLS in place, for example. So ensure that you identify all the controls that are required to implement in treating those risks. Note 1. Organization can design controls as required or identify them away from any resource. So there is no limitations that you should not implement this control or that control. If it satisfies and if it reduces the risk, if it is helpful, go ahead and implement those controls. That is okay. Compare the controls determined in 6.1.3 above with those in Annexure A. So Annexure A has some controls. I will talk about Annexure A in detail in my coming videos, but for now, understand that Annexure A has certain controls which you can implement to treat your risks, and verify that no necessary controls have been omitted. So if there is any necessary control, you make sure that you implement it. Just do not leave them. Don't omit them. Note, Annexure A control contains a list of possible information security controls. Users of this document are directed to Annexure A to ensure that no necessary information controls are overlooked. Annexure A talks about all the controls. I'll talk about those controls in detail. Wait for that video, but until then, you just understand that it is important to make sure that the controls are implemented and nothing is overlooked. It's just like saying that, okay, you know that this control is needed, but still you're skipping it. You should not do that. The information security controls listed in Annexure A are not exhaustive, and additional information security controls can be included if needed. So what it says is those Annexure A controls are not a boundary. If required, if your risk is so high that you need to add some additional controls to it, go ahead and implement it. That is absolutely fine. Produce a statement of applicability that contains the necessary controls. See 6.1.3b and 6.1.3. So what it says is you need to have a statement of applicability. Now, what is statement of applicability? I will have a separate document. I will have a separate video for it. But for now, understand that you need to have a document which says that what all have been applied in your organization. You can maintain a document related to that. Justification for their inclusion, why you're including those controls, why you're including those annexure controls, and if you're not including them, then you have to give a brief description about that as well, as to why you are excluding those. Okay, whether the necessary controls are implemented or not, have been implemented or not, the justification for excluding any annexure controls. So all these things will be there in the statement of applicability. So for now, understand that the statement of applicability document talks about all the annexure controls that you have included and that you have excluded with justification. I mean, I'm going to make a separate video on statement of applicability. Just wait for that video. Formulate an information security risk treatment plan. I've already talked about risk treatment plan in detail. So go ahead and watch that video. I'm again and again giving you, I'm again and again directing you to my part 1 video. Obtain risk owner's approval of information security treatment plan. Now, this is very interesting. What you need to do is once you have the risk treatment plan, talk to your risk owner and say, are you okay? This is how we are going to treat the risk. See, risk owner will have a good knowledge about how you need to treat the risk because he's the owner of that particular product. He's a subject matter expert, right? He will have more information about how to deal with that risk. So have a word with him. After you discuss with him, maybe he will give you better insights. So after you have a discussion with him, get an approval from him. Acceptance of the residual information security risk. Now, what is residual risk? This is a very interesting topic. This with example. Say I have a weak password policy in my organization, right? So what I have done, I have implemented a strong policy, password policy in my organization. But even after implementing a strong policy, uh, strong password policy in my organization, do you think I'm 100% secure? What if someone, uh, hacks my password, right? So there is still some amount of residue or residual risk still existing. So these residual risk percentage should be very less. So this residual risk also should be accepted by the risk owner. Password is, the chances of hacking the password is very less, right? So what I could do is I can have a multi-factor authentication. So with password policy and MFA in place, the chances of my password getting hacked is less. It can still be hacked, right? If someone get controls of my MFA, it can still be hacked, but the chances, the likelihood reduces. So you cannot have 100% security. Just accept that. You can never have 100% security. You should ensure that the risk owner accepts the residual risks. The organization shall retain documented information about the information security risk treatment process. The organization shall retain documented information about the information risks treatment process. So it is saying everything should be documented. So now you know what the auditor will look for to satisfy 6.1.3. It will ask you to show your risk treatment plan. The information security risks assessment and treatment plan should be very well documented. I hope that is clear. In my next video, we will be discussing about the most important document of ISO 27001, which is the Statement of Applicability, or also known as SOA. We will see how it helps the organization to decide which controls are required to be applied and why. So stay tuned. Thank you.